it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Arvind Mehrotra, who I'm sure is a person whose work is already well known to you, whether through his work as an anthologist, that groundbreaking anthology, I think of 1992, the Oxford India book of Indian poets writing in English, or as an essayist, or as a translator. I have been reading Arvind's work for a number of years, and I suppose where my main delight in his work has come is from his poetry and his translations. And I think there are two things to say about my experience of his poems. They combine. They move through different modes. One of the modes is the mode of a very acute but meditative awareness, often situated in a garden, of the way in which life is occurring in very different ways, both human and non-human, and it's sort of coming into presence and then falling away again. And that's actually extremely difficult to do. And Arvind, in my view, does it with quite with a kind of, well, grace was a word that was being referred to earlier, but with a kind of with grace, and it's not something that is just the result of a simple technique. It's much more than a technique. It's a sense of style. But what I mean by style there is the style that enables you to discover what it is that you're doing, not as an embellishment of some content. And then there are these poems that seem to be very clearly rooted in a certain place, and then there's the work that ranges very, very widely, whether in the form of a version of a dramatic kind of monologue, inhabiting identities from the past, whether through translation or through monologic recreation. There's that sense of the poet as somebody who can move almost into the identities and voices of others who are distant in time. It's a great pleasure, as I said earlier, to introduce him to you today, and it's a sign of my slight distraction that I've forgotten the title of his talk, and it's a sign of my further distraction. Oh no, good. Life is working. He's going to be talking about the work of a writer I don't know, Vinod Kumar Shukla. Is that the title, Arvind? And the title of the talk is "I Don't Have Wings," Vinod Kumar Shukla. So, Arvind, over to you.
Thanks, John, for those comments. Thanks, Amit, as always, for inviting me to this symposium. Gives me a chance to write something. I'm a very reluctant writer. It's one thing. I try, if I can avoid writing, I would avoid writing altogether. But this just forces me to think of something. So I was. There's not much thinking I did for this against storytelling. I'll read a story and I'll read some poems. I have a good precedent because Jeffrey O'Brien read a story, and so now I was a bit nervous, but I'll do one better. I'll even talk about Vinod Kumar Shukla. So I'll read a story, I'll read some of his poems, and I'll talk about this Vinod. Now, Vinod Kumar Shukla, I was just talking to John, before over lunch, that how certain very unexpected patterns form without anyone realizing, certainly without Amit realizing, that these patterns have formed. Just because he's got the magic of bringing a certain kinds of people together. So Gurvinder talked of Mani Kaul, his creative producer for your film, and Mani Kaul made one of his great films, on Vinod Kumar Shukla, on Naukar Ki Kameez. So these are the patterns that keep forming. I asked Amit, where did you hear of? How did he hear of Geoffrey O'Brien? And he said he read his introduction to Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights. So as these things happen, one immediately got hold of the introduction thanks to Google Books. So they showed the introduction, and in the last, so it is a marvelous introduction. And I was telling Geoffrey that, I think Elizabeth Hardwick writes somewhere that great criticism should be almost as great as the book they are writing about, and I think his criticism just almost raises to that level. And in this last sentence, I'll never forget it, he talks of this phrase live moments in Elizabeth Hardwick's in Sleepless Nights. And then live moments, of course, connects with the live moments that Gurvinder was talking about, and with Amit's opening paragraph. These are, now if you could only have live moments and nothing else, you don't need anything else, to be honest. You don't need anything other than live moments. Why go through, and I also seldom read novels. I don't know when I last read a novel from, but live moments I'm always looking out for. And my fascination with Vinod Kumar Shukla is precisely this live moment, which he brings into his, I've only done the short fiction, so I don't know much about his, I haven't even read Naukar Ki Kameez, by the way. So don't ask me any questions about Naukar Ki Kameez. But so I'll read these 3 or 4 poems, one short story which I've translated with my co-translator Sara Rai, and we are hoping to bring out a book of his short stories. The story is called The Burden, but before I start reading The Burden, which is just a page and a half, the story, I'll introduce Vinod Kumar Shukla. In one of his poems, the Hindi writer Vinod Kumar Shukla compares the flight of a bird to that of a butterfly. Leaving the earth, I'm sorry I don't have this poem in Hindi, I would have loved to read it in Hindi. Leaving the earth, mounting the air, does the bird know that it's the earth it is leaving? To fly above it, you really have to go high. And when it returns to settle on a tree, does the bird know that it's the earth it's returned to? I don't have wings. There's a small yellow butterfly flying above the earth. If a poem can be read as a metaphor for 2 kinds of writer, the bird writer and the butterfly writer, then Shukla clearly belongs to the latter species. Hence the title, I Don't Have Wings. The butterfly does have wings, but it flies close to the earth most of the time. The bird in Shukla's poem doesn't know what it is distant or cut off from, or what it is returning to. Shukla's vision, by contrast, operates at ground level. The poem he observes and writes about, the people he observes and writes about are the people who, when they step out of the house, carry with them a tattered shopping bag, into which go the haggled down vegetables they buy. An early poem of his from 1960 is about just this. So you can date the poem to 1960 because the amount he mentions when he goes out to buy vegetables is 10 rupees. And obviously we go with much more than 10 rupees when we go out to buy vegetables today. A street in the bazaar, a busy shopper, carrying a soiled, slightly torn bag in each hand, one empty, one full. Inside it, potatoes, leafy vegetables, a packet of garam masala, chilies, red or green. How I wish I could have been a 10 rupee note and found shelter in his bag. But I was holed up inside my own. These busy shoppers are modest people, and Shukla is a modest storyteller, making do with very little, or rather making with very little. He uses materials that are of the simplest. A man, a bicycle, a falling leaf of a neem tree, which will happen in the story which I'll read, dry and yellow and brittle, yet substantial enough to bear the weight of narrative. So the story I'll read is all about one leaf falling from a tree, and the entire story is about that leaf. It's called The Burden, and that's how heavy the leaf is. Boj, the Hindi title is Boj. I say weight, the weight of narrative. I say weight, though what I want to say is lightness. I have tried to remove weight, said Calvino in the first of his 6 memos for the next millennium. This is in the very first page, second page of his first chapter. I have tried to remove weight, sometimes from people, sometimes from heavenly bodies, sometimes from cities. Above all, I have tried to remove weight from the structure of stories and from language. We could say the same about Shukla's work, both his poetry and fiction. The Burden. This is the story that Sarah and I have translated. The Burden is just a page and a half. I'll read that, and I'll talk a little more about Shukla. He'd had his breakfast and was back home. No sooner was he back that he changed into his office clothes and put on his shoes. He oiled his hair and combed it. He picked up the bicycle keys and the lock to put on the door. The cycle was on the veranda, from where he took it out and started for office. This was his daily routine, which he went through without thinking too much about it. He was cycling fast even though he had plenty of time. The road ran along Phulbag. It took him about 20 minutes to reach his office. It was summer, and the dry leaves of the neem tree that lined either side of the road were constantly falling. Am I audible? Yes. Okay. One of the leaves got lodged in his pocket. Now this is his great crisis in his life, that one of the neem leaves, it falls from the tree and gets stuck inside his pocket. He found this odd. He continued to pedal, and as he did so, he put his left hand in the pocket and tried to take out the leaf. But it crumbled and stayed there. I mean, if you try to take a dry neem leaf out of your pocket, it will crumble and stay there. He stopped the bike and turned out the pocket to clean it. The leaf fragments in his pocket could hardly be called heavy, and neither did he have to stop the bike to remove them, but he stopped all the same. This is the boj, this is the weight of the leaf. He's deeply troubled by this wretched leaf which has fallen into his pocket. He reached Phulbag when it struck him that he might have forgotten to lock his room. He tried hard to remember, but a nagging doubt still remained. Yesterday the same thing had happened. He'd come halfway when he'd had to turn back. He wanted to check the lock if it was secure. He pulled at it and found that it was. Having made certain, he went to office with an easy mind. I've so often gone down the steps, then come up and to check if I have closed the door and pulled the lock. So this is a very familiar thing that this character is doing. He'd been paid 2 days ago. He had just one bed in his room and a trunk that he never locked, though he often thought that he should get one for it. He had kept his salary in the trunk inside the pocket of a freshly washed shirt. He then placed a handkerchief over the pocket to keep the money from falling out if the clothes were moved around. This way the money would also remain hidden, or at least not be immediately noticeable. He lived in a rented room behind Lashkar Hotel. Bhagwat, who worked for the hotel, would come round and sweep the rooms, starting with the ones on the left. He didn't think twice before entering a room, even if no one was there. Several times it happened that Bhagwat had come to sweep the room while he was taking a bath in the common facility. He'd hurried through the bath and returned quickly to the room. He didn't want Bhagwat to be there in his absence. He didn't trust these hotel employees one bit, though so far he had had nothing to complain. He had probably locked his room, he thought, but what if he hadn't? He felt annoyed with himself for being unsure. He could still go back and check. This time he felt certain that he had forgotten to lock it. His entire salary was in the trunk and he did not want to take a chance. If he went back, the extra peddling might tire him out, but at least the money would be safe. In any case, he was early for office. Even if he went back to the room to make sure, he wouldn't get late. Should he or should he not, he asked himself. Without being aware of what he was doing, he slowed down. He went round the traffic island at the same slow speed and then returned to his room, cycling really fast. He almost collided with a cart loaded with a slab of ice, but managed to avoid it at the last minute. Now, this is a detail that only Shukla can get, rushing back home and then almost colliding with the cart which was carrying ice, and then he avoided the collision at the last minute. He saw Bhagwat standing on the veranda as he approached the hotel. He didn't like this at all. He locked the bike and went up to his room. From the expression on his face and by his walk, he wanted to convey to Bhagwat that he was in a hurry and had forgotten something. I mean, he didn't want Bhagwat to know that he was worried about locking his room and he had left which is why he was coming back. So he pretended that he had forgotten something. While climbing the stairs, he turned round to look. Bhagwat was watching him. Oh shit, hope the bastard hasn't caught on, he thought. On reaching the room, he paused and looked behind him again. Bhagwat wasn't there. He pulled out the lock and found that it was fastened. He came down whistling, and there was a bounce in his step. He asked the Pandit, who was the hotel cook, for a glass of water, and then for another. He was thirsty. He left for office after drinking 2 glasses of water. He felt light-hearted. He stopped the bike at a restaurant that he passed and looked at the clock on the wall. It was not yet 11. He still had plenty of time. He'd been wise, he thought, to go back to his room and reassure himself about the lock. If he hadn't, he'd have been thinking about it all the time he was at work. These things do happen. After all, anyone can make a mistake, and the same mistake can be repeated. He would have lost the 150 rupees, his entire salary. How would he have then paid last month's bill and met this month's expenses? He may even have had to give up his room. He'd done the right thing, he told himself. In fact, what he had feared had happened once before. The lock he had at the time was a press lock. He'd gone out for a stroll in the evening, and half an hour later, when he returned, he found the lock hanging open. He'd forgotten to press the shank. It had got him worried, but his things were safe. He worked with a relaxed mind and came home in the evening. He unlocked the door. He was extremely tired. The moment he lay down, he felt sleepy. He closed his eyes and turned over on his side. It felt good to stretch his arms and legs. His daily round to the office and back required a lot of cycling, and his legs felt heavy, as though he'd climbed several flights of stairs to reach his room. After a while, he got up and opened the trunk. He took out all the money that was in the shirt pocket and went down to pay off his debts. He paid for the previous month's food and the rent. Then he handed Bhagwat a fiver to give to the dhobi. He was out of oil, soap and toothpaste which he bought from the corner store. He possessed just 2 handkerchiefs and purchased another. For the past month he'd been wondering if he should buy 2 more banyans, and this time he bought them. Banyans are vests, sort of singlets. He needed to buy chappals too, for he had just 1 pair of shoes. But with only 8 rupees and a few annas left to last him the whole month, he decided not to. So he decides not to buy any more chappals. He'd have bought them if he had some more money. He carried the stuff back to his room. The next morning, before setting out for office, he wore his new banyan, changed the set of clothes he was wearing, and equipped himself with the new handkerchief. He combed his hair and put on his shoes, and then picked up the bicycle and the lock. He'd only gone a short distance when the faint misgiving obscurely entered his mind that he'd forgotten to lock the room. He smiled and shook his head, then continued to go along at the same speed. If someone had then seen him smiling to himself, they'd have been surprised. There were neem trees on either side of the road. It was summer and hundreds of dry leaves were falling, but not one of them swirled down and found its way into his pocket. He carried on cycling without stopping or slowing down. So he just sort of goes to office and no neem falls a second time. The leaf did not find its way into the man's pocket, but we know where Shukla found his story. He found it in a moment we are all familiar with. It's when we realize that we may have left something unlocked, a house, a car, a piece of luggage, or left something on, like the gas burner. This also happens with both me and my wife. Have we left the milk on the gas? And then one of us, then we'll consult. Is the milk, did you? Once we have made sure that the house is locked, the burner turned off, we don't think of it again. It's this dead, unbreathing moment that Shukla revives before edging it away. He carried on cycling without stopping or slowing down. You begin to wonder if you are ever alive except when you discover yourself in the pages of a book. Anxiety is followed by a sense of relief. When he finds that the lock is fastened and his fear was unfounded, the man comes down whistling and there is a bounce in his step. At one point, a little earlier in the story, he covers the money in the shirt pocket with a handkerchief. This is something that a coyote or a woodpecker, creatures that hide the food cache, would have recognized. It's an act as avian or animal as it is human. We all hide our purses, our house keys, and even if there are predatory servants around, our food. Say middle class Indians always worried, that naukar khana kha jayenge. That the servants are going to open the fridge in your absence and eat all the chocolates or whatever. Shukla's storytelling turns on small everyday acts, often on the things that flicker and vanish in the mind's peripheral vision before we can quite see them. This is what poems also do. They try and grasp a disappearing thought or impression and bring it into hard focus. As the title poem of Shukla's first full-length collection has it, that man put on a new woolen coat and went away like a thought. I don't know if you are familiar with the Hindi title. वो आदमी चला गया नया गरम कोट पहनकर विचार की तरह. That man put on a new woolen coat and went away like a thought. In rubber flip-flops, I struggled behind. The time was 6 a.m, the time of hand-me-downs, and it was freezing cold. 6 a.m. was like 6 a.m. There was a man standing under a tree. In the mist, it looked like he was standing inside his own blurred shape. The blurred tree looked exactly like a tree. To its right was a blurred horse of inferior stock, looking like a horse of inferior stock. The horse was hungry, the mist like a grassy field to him. There were other houses, trees, roads, but no other horse. There was only one horse. I wasn't that horse, but my breath when I panted was indistinguishable from the mist. If the man standing at that one spot under the tree was the boss, then to him I was a horse at a gallop, horseshoes nailed to my boot soles. There are in the poem two thoughts. The first is the thought of the disappearing man in the new woolen coat, which can be called the tenor. The second is the thought with which the first thought, the man in the woolen coat, is compared. This we can call the vehicle. While he diverts our attention with metaphor and linguistic play, 6 a.m. was like 6 a.m, which in Hindi is subah 6 baje ka waqt, subah 6 baje ka waqt. Subah 6 baje ka waqt, 6 baje ka waqt tha. That's what he says. Shukla surreptitiously introduces his moral vision. The play is deadly serious. We recall Calvino's idea of lightness, where lightness does not mean lightweight. There was only one horse. I wasn't that horse, protests the speaker. of the poem, the man in rubber flip-flops. But in the eyes of the boss, he is a horse at a gallop, horseshoes nailed to his boot soles. The working man has changed places with the workhorse. The boss remains what he is, an unattainable idea of wealth, someone snug in the woolen coat of his thoughts. Shukla in the poem identifies with the man in flip-flops, just as he does with the man who lacks money to buy, after meeting the month's expenses, a new pair of chappals. To change the butterfly metaphor, Shukla could be described in similar terms: the writer in cheap footwear. Against storytelling sags into against writing, against a certain idea of writing, of writer. The Shukla is a very exceptional, and he flies in the face of all ideas of who a writer. Mantra has been to his house, and so Mantra will know a lot more about him. I've never visited him, but Mantra agrees with this idea that he's totally unlike any other writer that we can think of. At the Jaipur Literature Festival 2011, Vinod Kumar Shukla asked Sara Rai, who was my co-translator in this, why so many people were standing in line, each clutching a book. And he actually turned to this person and said, why is everyone holding a book? And what is this long line from here to there? Told they were all waiting to have this book signed by J.M. Coetzee, he looked puzzled. Now, Hindi writers sign books, but privately, and seldom is there a line of people waiting for them to do so. Moreover, the name Coetzee meant nothing to him, nor did the names of the other world writers present on the occasion. He had not heard of Coetzee. That everyone I asked a lot of his friends. He says, no, he would not have. There's no way he could have heard of him. And this, despite the fact that his own books have been translated into French, Italian, and English. One explanation for it could be that he reads only in Hindi, which perhaps has more speakers than Mandarin Chinese, but in which little gets translated. Even if it were, you doubt whether Shukla would be interested. Recently, when he was asked in an email if he was familiar with any European writers, for it is they who often come to mind when you read him, Shukla did not evade the question. He simply ignored it. The question did not deserve an answer. I mean, this is a completely stupid question to ask Vinod Kumar Shukla if he's heard of Calvino or Walser or what have you. There is nothing of me except what is here, Shukla says in one poem. Shukla's here is a specific place, Raipur, and before that Rajnandgaon, both cities in the tribal belt of India. Rajnandgaon is where he was born in 1937 into a family of Saryuparan Brahmins who hailed from Uttar Pradesh. And Raipur is where he taught agricultural extension at the Indira Gandhi Agricultural University. It meant traveling to the surrounding villages and acquainting farmers with new agricultural techniques. He retired as associate professor in 1996. This is not your usual trajectory of a great writer, but therein lies the paradox of Vinod Kumar Shukla. The great writers don't teach agricultural extension at Indira Gandhi Krishi Vishwavidyalaya in Raipur. Though there was until the 1960s little to distinguish Rajnandgaon and Raipur from the other wayside stations on the Howrah-Bombay rail line, in Shukla's eyes they encompass the known world. Shukla's world is Rajnandgaon and Raipur, and he says that, which is why that poem, everything of me that is, all I have or all I know is here. There's nothing of me outside of this place. Were it left to him, he would still be living in the house of his childhood that he writes about in his autobiographical essay, Old Veranda. Actually his Hindi is very interesting because he uses the word for veranda, which is parchi, which is the word I wasn't familiar with, and we asked him, Purani parchi. Now parchi is not but in Madhya Pradesh, parchi, as Mantra will tell us, is a veranda, Purani parchi. Ours was a family of 4 brothers living under one roof. And then comes this typical Shukla move. The roof's shadow belonged to my youngest uncle. Now, how Shukla gets the idea that we were four brothers living under one roof, and then the roof's shadow belonged to my youngest uncle, who was called Chachaji. He was called this at home and also outside. Everyone called him Chachaji, at home and outside. But wherever he was, he largely kept to himself. Everyone was in awe of him. If he stepped out of the house more than he usually did, he came up against the world as if against a wall. He came up against it even when he was at home. That he comes up against a wall when he's outside the house, but he comes up against a wall even when he is at home. As happens in joint families, there were quarrels. Guns would come out, but were never fired. The women never quarreled. Perhaps this was because of Amma, who continued to work quietly despite the chaos of marriages, births, and deaths. I don't know how, but her quiet would have a calming effect on those who were grieving, and those who were full of joy would find the space around them expand to accommodate their laughter. Amma would, this is all from his autobiography, Purani Parchi. Amma would be up when it was still dark and would be the last to sleep. You could hear her in the kitchen putting things away, the clattering sounds like a lullaby for the night, sending it to sleep. Even the plants listened to her. As soon as it was twilight, the guava, the drumstick tree, and the tulsi in the courtyard would doze off, as would the soft grass in the corner and the 2 tomato plants that had appeared on the rubbish heap. The tall peepal tree to the east of the house would look in, and seeing the other plants asleep, go to sleep itself. If she saw an ant in the fire crawling on a dung cake, she would pull out the dung cake and save the ant. In the same way, she would save us from small everyday fires and hope they wouldn't recur. The burn on her hand would not have healed before she burned herself again. Her daily routine was like a thread, going through the different things she did, stringing them together. She never felt the needle's prick, but I did. In the papers, I read about a man who was hospitalized and discovered to have hundreds of needles in his body. Was my condition similar to that man's? The large family living under one roof is an idea that recurs also in a poem. By the time the poem ends, though, the family has become the human race, and the one roof is not of a house in Rajnandgaon, but the sky. A particular childhood memory has here opened out into a feeling that is not dissimilar to what W.H. Auden called a vision of agape, a vision of shared unerotic love. Going a step further, Shukla shares the feeling with all of creation, including the earth. And this is the poem. Had we all lived together under one roof without separate kitchens, grandfather, great-aunt, father, uncle, siblings, and remained in the same neighborhood, grass lives next to grass, mud next to mud, and in the wind live storms, hurricanes, and scent-laden gusts, unbroken without knots. The earth's wind is one with our breathing. Shukla, who seldom travels and has been outside India perhaps only 3 or 4 times on literary junkets, would agree with Hazlitt that foreign travel specially makes men pedants, not artists. What we seek, we must find at home or nowhere. Shukla must be among the few writers alive whose work has appeared in journals where world literature is published or discussed, Granta, Modern Poetry in Translation, Some Kind of Beautiful Signal, The Baffler, N+1, but who has heard neither of these journals nor of World Lit. In contrast to his unawareness of the term and his indifference to the subjects that keep the assembly line of global fiction moving, historical trauma, acts of terrorism, personal turmoil is the attention he lavishes on the fleeting observations, thoughts, memories, and gestures that for most of us, regardless of where we live, constitute our lives. To read him is not to read a fictionalized version of what is already known, but what is constantly being inscribed in and erased from the margins of our consciousness.
We have a short time for questions, and I'm sure you may have some. I just wanted to ask you one, and it's an obvious question, but I think an important one. What did you discover something in the translation of his work? Or were the classic problems of things getting lost in translation constantly confronting you? Do you want to?
No, are you talking about the difficulty of?
Yeah.
No, nothing. You see, I think the most difficult part to translate in any translation are the simplest parts. You know, the simplest words, the simplest phrases, the simplest conversation. They are the hardest things to get, because they appear so naturally in this case in Hindi, that in English you just want to make it sound as natural as you possibly can. So it's the simplicity of Shukla and the wordplay. It's the 6 o'clock in the morning was like 6 o'clock in the morning. सुबह 6 बजे का वक्त 6 बजे के वक्त जैसा था. Something like that. And he just बत्तखों का झुंड बतख जैसा था. He keeps going back to these phrases. And sometimes the wordplay is more intricate. So you have to get the syntax of what he is trying to say. Apart from that, no. I'm just no particular difficulties.
Questions from thoughts from the audience? Yes, Amit.
Sorry.
Lovely phrase at the end, margins of our consciousness. What's the Hindi original? Do you remember? This was your.
This was my.
We were talking about Shukla on the phone.
Yes.
And you mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah, we were, and this was leading to the question. Sorry, I need more coffee, I think. But this is leading to the question. Going back to, I suppose it's okay to talk about the fact that we had a chat about Vinod Kumar Shukla's stories, and the phrase "margins of our consciousness" came up. During that conversation, and you were talking about the fact that the culture. This goes back to certain things that were being discussed earlier today, but that the fact that the culture we live in now in India had a little place for what's on the margins of our consciousness, and why is Shukla valuable? Why is what is on the margins of our consciousness valuable? That sounds like an idiotic question, but it's still worth thinking about. And I mean, is it true that the culture here makes little room for these margins? What's on the margins of our consciousness?
Well, I think the only poems may be one place where these things can happen. Something which you. But otherwise, I don't read much fiction. Other than your fiction, obviously. But where else? Arundhati Roy, there's no room for margins. There's only room for headlines. From a latest novel, from what I've read. I'm sure the same would be the case with who else? Ghosh, Amitav Ghosh. There is no question of any margins. There are some big historical dramas which are taking place.
These are obviously important to a lot of people.
They may, yeah. I'm sure.
What is the case for this margins?
Then that's just marginalized writers. No, they are. No, but it's really what fascinates you as a reader. And I'm not particularly interested in the world's headlines coming back to me in paperback form. And so the world's headlines should be read in broadsheets, and they should remain in broadsheets. Now then to sort of come back as paperback, and why should I have to buy the world's headlines in Khan Market? The newspaper boy delivers them every morning. So which is my reluctance to read fiction of a certain, what is around. But Shukla reminds me of who I am. And that's what I said. It's only when I read him that I discovered that I too do these same things. I too go and look at the lock, whether it's a press lock, whether it's left hanging or it's actually. So he's really addressing my concerns, but those concerns are never part of my consciousness. They are in the margins of my consciousness, and which is why they happen, and then I push them away. Then they're forgotten. Which is why I say that you only begin to you lead a dead life till someone brings that life alive to you in the pages of a book. Then you realize, okay, this is what you are. You are not that headline that is coming back to you. So which is why I value him so much.
Yes, there's a question there. And yes, please. Yeah, sorry.
I was really interested in how you describe Shukla as somebody who's divorced from this world literary scene and somebody who's very provincial in his own right. And I was wondering then, what does translation do to that provincialism? Does that sort of pierce this provincial world that he's created? Is there a way in which it gets translated? Because to translate is also to globalize in a sense, right? Especially in English, where everybody has access to it and everybody can read it.
They translate what?
His work. Because if he's talking about his own home in writing.
So should we not translate it? Is that what you are saying? So it remains where it is.
Yeah, I'm asking then. What are the politics of translation then?
Well, the politics of translation is that if Rahul Soni publishes it and buys the stories, I hope he'll pay us everyone a lot of money. So that there's no politics to it. It's just pure finance. I don't know from where these big words enter into. So you do a spot of work. There is a page before you. You translate it. You try and sell it. Why else would anyone suffer? So we'll try and sell this. Some of these things we have sold. We have maybe sold one thing to Granta, something to N+1. So let's hope we can sell the other stories and everyone becomes rich and lives happily ever after. But other than that, so no other thought enters my mind. There's no room. There's no idea of provincial, global, loss, gain. It's those concerns are just so remote from my mind. I just sit at my desk and I do that's for others to whether I'm selling something or I'm doing something wrong or right or good or bad. Those thoughts really cannot enter your mind. They just the minute you write something, your first idea is will someone buy it? So that's so. It happens with poems also. I try and sell it to Poetry Chicago. They pay $300. They've never bought anything so far, but one day they'll pay me $300 for it. Just imagine that. So.